Welcome everybody. I think I might make a start as everyone is joining because we have a lot to get through in the next hour and I don't want to waste a minute of the time we have with everybody. Before we get started though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us here today. Well, it is International Clinical Trials Day, so happy International Clinical Trials Day to everyone. Today is a day to acknowledge the important role that clinical trials play in advancing medical science and healthcare, and of course, all the amazing individuals that work in the industry to make new treatments possible. And this includes doctors, nurses, patients, carers, scientists, anyone that's dedicated to advancing healthcare. We see you today and we say thank you. And thank you to everyone that's joining us, and particularly so late in the afternoon for what we think is an important conversation on asking your doctor about clinical trials and bridging the clinical trial conversation gap. We have some amazing panelists joining us here this afternoon to explore and further unpack this topic. And they include Murray Turner, who's the CEO from Psoriasis Australia. We've got Associate Professor Peter Foley, who's Head of Dermatology Research at St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne. He's also the Director of Research at the Skin Health Institute. We've got Associate Professor Jeremy Hudson, who's a Clinical Director, North Queensland Skin Centre and Chair of Specific Interest Group, RACGP. And Lillian Lee, who's a lawyer and patient advocate, and Dr. Susie Hart, who's the National Program Manager for Partner Network, which is a program enabling rural primary care clinical trials. So we really look forward to learning more about that from Susie. I'd also like to introduce and acknowledge my colleague, Michelle DeVito-Smith, who's going to be managing the Q&A channel today. If you feel free to use the chat channel to make any comments, but if you have any burning questions that you want addressed by any of the panelists or brought into the discussion this afternoon, please pop them into the Q&A. And I know Michelle will do her best to bring those into the conversation. And of course, Fiona Cameron, my colleague and co-founder, who's just in the background there working diligently to make sure everything goes smoothly and we don't run into any tech issues. So what is the clinical trial conversation gap? So I just want to do a little bit of scene setting before we get stuck into this conversation. So very often patients are advised to ask their doctor about clinical trials. But do we have a medical community that is prepared and well equipped to have these conversations with patients? And do patients feel confident enough to know what they're asking about or to even ask about clinical trials? So the clinical trial conversation gap is really what we see as a critical missed opportunity for the sharing of information that could be potentially transformative to a person's healthcare journey and health outcomes. And it can occur for a variety of reasons, including those that I just mentioned, but also patients feeling uncomfortable about speaking up in medical settings. Patients frequently see their doctors as authority figures and fear that their questions may be perceived as challenging their doctor's expertise or recommendations. And from a clinician perspective, they're often faced with extremely busy workloads. So time pressure in daily practice may present as a barrier. Lack of access to information about available clinical trials could be a potential barrier. And sometimes clinicians may harbour uncertainties about trial processes that could also, hinder their confidence to engage in conversations about trials with their patients. And I just want to flag that when we are talking about doctors today, we're referring to doctors in primary care settings as well as specialists. I don't think the problem is unique to any specialty or setting. And of course, the problems can occur at both the patient level and the clinician level. So it's important to take that into consideration. So how can we empower patients to confidently explore all treatment options while simultaneously supporting clinicians in having meaningful discussions about clinical trials with their patients. Well, our panelists today bring valuable and diverse insights and expertise that will hopefully guide us towards some practical solutions, or at least getting us thinking a little bit differently about, how we think about this topic and this important healthcare intersection. Now, Jeremy Hudson, I know you have to leave us about 20 minutes early today. So firstly, thank you very much for making time to be here. We're very grateful for your participation. But I'm going to lean on you first to kickstart the discussion today. Now, I know, Jeremy, you work full-time as a GP in Townsville. You're the director of a research clinic. You're involved in national policy development, advisory groups, and you're part of international research for clinical trials on melanoma detection and management. You're a busy man. How are you incorporating the clinical trial conversation into practice with your patients? And what do you perceive to be the biggest challenges for GPs in having conversations with patients?
Yeah, well, I'm lucky because I run a private clinic where we actually have the leisure time to do this. So I'm in a bit of a different scenario to most of the GPs and how the government wants to run it, which is primarily bulk billed. And unfortunately, the way that the government is working at the moment is they will support shorter consultations, but at the moment they're declining to help fund longer consultations. As most people might know, if a GP has a longer consultation, they deal with multiple issues. They lose money because you get less money for longer, more complex consultations. Same in rural areas when we have particularly vulnerable groups and GPs who have, say, specific interests and may do a lot of telehealth with patients. They don't get rebated for that or won't be under the new My Medicare homes. So just to say that it isn't the same for all GPs. I'm lucky because I get paid enough. I have the time to do this with my patients, but most GPs have the time or really the funding or the leisure time to do this. So that's probably the biggest barrier, is a sort of non-supportive longer consultations for patients and doctors. I tend to use apps like ClinTrial Refer and educate the patient on how to use it, guide them to some groups like the Melanoma Institute where they can talk to a clinical trial coordinator. And I think the more support we have like that, the better. So say melanoma nurses or clinical trial coordinators will, even if we're not going to go through it step by step, to refer them on to someone who can have the time to do that, who's funded to do that, would be great. I think the apps and the online portals are good, but they have a lot to improve on in terms of user interface and translating it to a patient-friendly language. You can only get them so far, and then you have to spend quite a bit of time, even for clinicians, working through what drugs are actually what drugs. And that's a big barrier as well. So they could go a lot better on user interface and accessibility.
Yeah. Now, Jeremy, a couple of years ago, you may recall, I was actually part of organising 2 GP roundtable discussions with ClinTrial Refer that you mentioned, and in partnership with the Australian Healthcare and Hospital Association and Deeble Institute for Health Policy Research, where we explored how to better integrate clinical trials into primary care settings, and looking at what the barriers and the enablers were. And one of the key insights that came out of those discussions was the critical need to help general practitioners better understand the value proposition around clinical trials. So essentially, it was felt that any resources or tools that might exist to help connect GPs with research information that you mentioned, like the apps, would essentially have limited impact if those GPs didn't fundamentally value the output of those tools being clinical trials themselves. So how do you feel about that? And do you agree with that? And if so, how do we shift this perception and demonstrate the genuine value of trials to busy GPs in everyday practice?
Well, I think almost every doctor, including GPs, wants to have the best outcome for the patients, and they want to be able to suggest a wide range of options and make it patient-centered care. And so I think the value's there. I do suggest the clinical trial apps to a lot of doctors when we do education. And of course, it is built into our CPD or professional development now, where they can get CPD for referring patients to clinical trials. And that's had a good degree of success. It's a small carrot. It helps. It helps. I just think we're limited by the overall environment where we're not supported to spend longer with patients. If that was, doctors, I'm sure would spend more time doing that.
So could that be accommodated through an MBS item code that's specific to clinical trial consultations?
It could do. How successful that would be is an interesting question. We could certainly raise that with the Department of Health. Yeah. That's doable. They might be lukewarm about it, but if we get enough support, we could do that. Yeah.
Not meaning to put you under any pressure in the moment, but just something to think about, I suppose. Yeah, and that's what this conversation is intended for, really, to just help us think laterally about, what we can do, like identify where the problems exist and what we could potentially do to circumvent those issues.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I actually sit on that government advisory group, so it's something I might tentatively put the feelers out and see what people think.
Well, that's
Um,
super.
but it is the health economists at the end of the day that kind of make the decision, and they're always a bit leery about spending more money when they don't have to. And
Yeah,
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 so
yeah,
it's a good point. We'll
yeah.
raise that. Yeah,
Great.
certainly.
And so another piece of feedback that came through those discussions was that some GPs don't actually see it as their role to refer into clinical trials. They see it as the job of a specialist. So, what are your views on that?
Well, we have about 39,000 GPs at the moment and more in the pipeline. And you'll find that there's a broad spectrum of what GPs do. So some will be incredibly keen to do it and some won't want to touch it. And that's just the natural distribution you'll get with anything in general practice, including doing pap smears or blood pressure or migraines or what have you. So that's to be expected. And yeah, by mentioning it in clinical practice and giving CPD, we may encourage more of a shift to people doing it. What I do find is you do get GPs who tend to be very, very good at what they do. These tend to be post-fellowship GPs, say 5 years post-fellowship, who are, say, very good at this topic or very good at that topic. And they will be the local GP who other GPs refer to for tricky cases or things like melanomas. And they have a particular role with knowing about clinical trials. And what we often find in these discussions, and that's what I'd refer to as a GP with specific interests, is often we'll have a better knowledge of those specific clinical trials than sometimes the oncologists will. Oncologists sometimes at the tertiary centers will have a very broad overview, but they say won't know about the latest melanoma trials. So there's a role with teamwork for those GPs and the oncologists to work together. So for example, we have a strong working relationship with Townsville Hospital, and sometimes I'll contact the oncologist and say, this clinical trial might be suitable for this patient, and vice versa. So it's all about a collaborative team-based approach, and the more we can just support that, the better.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. So, Peter, I think I'm going to bring you into the conversation now and get some insights from your experience as a specialist and principal investigator for more than 170 clinical trials over many years. How does what Jeremy's been saying contrast or compare to your experience, and what approaches have you found most effective in having conversations with patients about clinical trials?
Thanks, Christine. It's interesting hearing what Jeremy said. I'd never really thought about the fact that the way the MBS, the Medicare system, is set up really discourages GPs spending time talking to patients. So if someone comes in with a problem, they're encouraged to write a prescription, get them out the door, and therefore the GPs don't have the opportunity to say, look, I can give you what's available, but it's not perfect and the side effect profile isn't great, but there's a new treatment that might be an option for you. And just running through that takes time. And if you're being punished financially as a GP for not spending that time, you can see where that's going to be put on the back burner. That's not going to be a priority for a GP, because in many areas we have effective treatments, just there's room for improvement. I mean, no one's trying to design a new therapy, be it a drug or an intervention, that's worse than what we have available. Everyone's trying to improve. The whole idea of trials is to find more effective treatments that are safer. So there's the incentive is, I want to do the best for my patient, but what we've got at the moment, maybe it's not too bad, and why am I going to get kicked for it? So I think it is hard to recruit, or as a GP, it's hard as a specialist to recruit someone for a trial if you have a really effective therapy. And really, if someone comes in and they've got high blood pressure, you've got dozens of options. So why would you send someone off for a hypertension trial, particularly when it might be placebo-controlled? But if you have something which some people might think is trivial, like fungal infection in the toenail. So if you're diabetic, you run the risk of getting cellulitis and other problems. It's disfiguring, issues with tinea. The treatments aren't all that wonderful. The side effect profile, so the effectiveness isn't great. The side effect profile is not wonderful. So if there's a trial for a new treatment, it might be, look, here's a trial for something that might be better, be it safety or efficacy, than what we have available. And it's particularly encouraging if there is an active comparator. So placebo-controlled trials, regulatory authorities love, and I'm talking about drug trials here, but as a patient, as an investigator, comparator trials are much more attractive. So we're caught between gold standard, show that it's not just a placebo effect, but active comparators are more attractive. I think one of the trials that we are involved with, sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but the standard of care at the moment for someone with the skin cancer is regular follow-up. So we're trying to see if particular forms of imaging are going to improve over and above standard of care. So the comparator there is regular checks. The intervention is something on top of what's normally done. And so if there's a GP, it might be, well, you can come back and see me, or you can go into a trial. And I just happen to know this trial says, keep seeing your GP or keep seeing your specialist to see if the device, the machine, picks things up over and above, or is it missing things, or is it more accurate? So I think it's the appeal for the patient or the participant has to be, it's going to work better, or it's going to be safer than what's available. So I think, and it takes time, and we're all time poor, and so trying to find that time can be difficult. And if you're a GP and you think, well, I know I've got this treatment, but really it should be, if a treatment doesn't come immediately to mind, is there an option for a trial?
And I think what you're saying, Peter, goes back to the value proposition and really understanding when trials might be an option for patients. As you mentioned, obviously, if there are standard of care treatment choices available that might be effective and haven't been tried yet, you're going to go down that pathway first. But when standard of care treatment options are ineffective, there are none, or there are just no treatment options available, but that's when the clinical trial conversation probably really should be happening. So I know you commented on, and agreed with Jeremy about the issues with having those conversations in the primary care setting, but how does that compare amongst your colleagues and in the specialty you're in?
I think it just depends on how many treatment options there are. I mean, I have a particular interest in psoriasis. It's becoming a little bit of a crowded space, but not everyone can afford to come and see me every 3 or 6 months or afford the medication. Clinical trial, the medication, the investigational product is provided free of charge. So there's no cost for seeing the doctors looking after you. There's no cost for the intervention. It's just, if it's placebo controlled, you might get a dummy treatment. So I think the conversation for psoriasis, pretty hard first-line treatment, but if they've failed other therapies, and some of the new trials coming through are for people that are treatment resistant or inadequate responders to treatment. So if someone doesn't respond to first-line treatment, what's out there? Do I go for what's next on the list, or do I think of a new intervention? For other areas, there's so many dermatological conditions that would fit into the criterion of rare disease that we don't have a lot of evidence. So if there's a trial available, at least we're going to know if it's appropriate for someone with an uncommon condition, which is what we're doing at the moment with blistering diseases. We have a list of drugs that we use, and none of them have been proven in a trial setting. So we're trying to get trials that show that what the standard of care is and what the new intervention is, whether we're improving on what's available.
Yeah. Now, just before, I'm going to come to you, Lillian, in a second. But just before I do, question for either Jeremy or you, Peter. How do patients typically respond when you bring up clinical trials with them? Are they receptive to the idea of clinical trials? And maybe you've got different experiences. Who wants to tackle that question first?
I'll just briefly say, go on, Peter. Yep.
No, you go.
You go.
Generally quite responsive. Most people see you as quite a value adder, at least to know about it. Now the option's open for discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And Peter?
I don't think anyone opposes being introduced to a clinical trial, but if you just say it's a clinical trial, some people think I'm going to be a guinea pig, and there's this perception that they don't want to be experimented on because it's a trial. And I think that's part of the education process of, well, you've got the scientific preclinical work to show that it should be effective. And then, yes, we do have guinea pigs, healthy control, phase 1, where people are being monitored really, really closely to make sure it's safe. And then you try the intervention. Once you've shown it's safe, try the intervention in the appropriate population. So you've done that work. So the patient that's coming to see me or Jeremy isn't the trial they're entering into is not where they're the crash test dummies. They're in a trial that's already been shown to be safe, and you really want to see what's the long-term safety and what's the effectiveness. So I think that people don't understand that they're not just the experimental animal. And that's our education.
You just brought another question to my head. Sorry, Lillian, I'm getting to you next. But when you said guinea pigs, a lot of people viewed the COVID-19 pandemic as a pivotal moment to highlight the importance of clinical trials. But there was a lot of division within the medical community regarding vaccine safety that led to widespread public confusion and maybe some diminished trust in health authorities. Have you experienced the effects of this or felt the effects of this in your consultations with patients or not?
I haven't, because I think in the trials that I'm involved with, the pharmaceutical item trials, we can talk to the patients. There's been a phase 1 trial, there's been a phase 2 trial, we're now in phase 3 trial, big patient population numbers. I was a little bit skeptical, a little bit cynical myself with some of the vaccines coming through, but then having sat through a presentation by an infectious diseases physician involved in the development process, he pointed out they were being done in parallel. So things were being halted. They weren't just being pushed through. So
Mm.
they were very conscious, and they were very aware of looking at both the safety and effectiveness. So I think because we're not running different phase trials simultaneously, there's
Mm.
less pushback because we've got the previous phase that we can refer to.
Mm. I think
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is that communication is super important. And the problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So, you know, the doctors and the clinicians always have the knowledge, but it's imparting that in a way that makes sense to the public. Sorry, Jeremy, I cut you off then.
No, that's good. I think Peter's making some great points, and it's all about having the time to communicate. And just like vaccines and clinical trials, you need to have the time to talk to people. Most GPs will get training in that. Interestingly, talking about clinical trials, it's usually patient perception, from my point of view, that the patients think the pharmaceutical groups don't want to be producing effective medications. And they say, oh, you know, I might as well use my herbal supplement that Barry suggested because all the pharmacies, you know, they don't want to put out effective drugs. They want a lot of disease out there. And so that's more of the opposite, actually, I'm finding. You have to educate people that there are interests in valid medications. But as Peter says, looking at the previous trials that show it's effective have been very, very useful. And
Yeah.
news, I will get most people requesting a trial if it's been in the news.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Lillian, thank you so much for being here today. As I mentioned at the beginning, you are a lawyer, you're a patient advocate, but you're also a patient and someone that's participated in a clinical trial before. But you discovered information about the trial that you participated in from sources outside your specialist. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how that may have affected any expectations you had with your treating clinician?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I wish I could keep listening to both of you talk and share your experiences. I have so much to say in reply as well. I think it's such a great conversation and we don't have very much time. But my own experience started over 10 years ago, about 10 and a half years ago. I was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer with a very, very rare mutation. And the first treatment that I received was a targeted therapy that I could not respond. Well, I responded very well to, in a way, in that the tumors shrunk, but in terms of toxicity, I couldn't tolerate it. And so I had to terminate with a lot of psychological pain. While the first 6 months while I was on that drug, I was in touch with a lot of different people, trying to seek more information. Being a lawyer, I wanted to know a lot about my disease. And so I was very lucky to have met a lot of people in the US who knew a lot about the rare mutation that I had or have. And one of those people was actually a patient who himself was a medical scientist who followed the preclinical studies and results of the drugs that were coming up for clinical trial and told me about a phase 1 trial. So when I couldn't tolerate the first treatment, I was given a trial protocol that actually, when I saw it, I knew it didn't apply to me because I knew that it wasn't the indication that I had wasn't part of the inclusion eligibility criteria. And so immediately I didn't want to say anything to my oncologist because I didn't want to be disrespectful. And in my conversations with this gentleman in the US, he answered a lot of my questions. And one of my questions was, it's in Melbourne, I'm based in Sydney. Is it even possible that I can travel there? So there were all sort of logistics questions. I wanted to make sure that it's possible, that I wasn't dreaming before I raised it with my doctor. So the next appointment, he was probably going to tell me about this trial, but I sort of raised it first and said, look, now that you said that this protocol that you gave me didn't apply to me, what about this trial in Melbourne? Because I'm really interested in going and I know that I can, even though I had a 3-year-old. He, to my relief, gave the investigator in Melbourne a call and said that he would make arrangements. So long story short, I started the trial 10 years ago. I was on the trial until it ended. and I'm still on the same medication. And Peter, I was a guinea pig. I was in the phase 1 clinical trial. I was very lucky in a dose escalation trial that I got the dose that was perfect for me. And I've been on that drug since.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, how did you feel though about learning about the study through sources outside your own doctor? Did you expect that, you know, your treating oncologist would provide that information to you? Was that an expectation you had, or did you not know about clinical trials prior to this?
So I grew up in a medical family, and so I knew that doctors weren't infallible. You know, they can't know everything about everything, and I think with a rare disease, I kind of expected that that my oncologist probably didn't know a lot about it. So you know, it wasn't a surprise to me that he didn't know. I think what was interesting was that the information that I got from my online research, from the online forums that were available at the time, we didn't have Facebook groups, but now we've got Facebook groups for these rare mutations that we actually share a lot of information. I learned a lot through educated, well, sort of credible sources from other patients, other clinicians that are online. And so I think, yeah, I was very lucky that I was able to do that. I think, you know, in terms of luck, it doesn't escape me that I'm educated, I understand English, I can read, and you know, I have some health literacy, and I'm in the city, so I have access to clinical trials. I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of accessibility.
Yeah. So you said you've got good health literacy, you're educated, but you know, not everyone's fortunate in that respect. How can we better support patients in advocating for themselves?
This for me.
Yeah, yeah. What's
How?
your view? Yeah.
Look,
Or what can we do to, I suppose, maybe support doctors to be thinking about having these conversations with patients, like when they're not in a position to be thinking about clinical trials themselves?
yeah, look, I think there's a lot that we can do as a society to increase health literacy generally. I think when I speak to other patients about the clinical trials clinical trial that I was on, often I get asked those questions about it. So are you taking sugar pills? Are you like, what does that mean? There's a lot of uncertainty, I guess, about what trials are. So I think generally speaking, I think we need to upskill as a nation in terms of our health literacy. I think in terms of conversations with our clinicians, I think, you know, exactly what Jeremy was saying about time. You know, my dad, who's in a bulk billing practice with non-English speakers, that's a very different situation to Jeremy, from what I understand. And so I think, you know, having the resources that are readily available, and educating the new generation of clinicians, whether they're GPs or specialists, to have open conversations, not making assumptions about people's understanding or capacity, or willingness to participate in trials, and having an open dialogue and giving options. I think it's a patient's right to know what options are out there, and it needs to be trials need to be part of that if it is applicable, so that the patients can make those decisions.
Yeah, no, thank you. So Murray, you're the CEO of Psoriasis Australia, but you've got your own experience as a patient and a carer. How do you identify with the comments being made so far? Are there any familiar themes that compare to what you hear from patients through your work with Psoriasis Australia?
Yeah, agree with everything that's being said. I think there's two themes that, you know, from Peter's end and Lillian's end of, you know, we hear from patients that, you know, immediately they hear clinical trial and think that they're a guinea pig. And that's because we're in the dermatology space, and, you know, people hear that word and think, well, why am I going to be the one they're going to test the drug on? and they may not have the understanding that it's already gone through the phase 1, phase 2 trials, and they're doing the, you know, the efficacy type, you know, analysis and determining what medication is best against another one. But then I also think there's two sets of patients. There's patients that we see that from a dermatology perspective that are questioning why should they participate in one, and what, because of they don't understand what a clinical trial is. But then you have patients like Lillian that would jump at any opportunity to participate in a clinical trial because they have a life-threatening condition that medication or that trial may extend their life. So I think there's two extremes of, like, they're polar opposites of people. I think that the key theme that I'm hearing is that education is key. It's, you know, we need to, from our perspective as a patient organisation, need to educate people that clinical trials aren't being a guinea pig because of the space that we're in. It's also educating them to let them know that they're being monitored probably better than they can, but that they probably would be if they were on a normal, you know, go and get their script and fill it and go home and take the medication. If they're participating in a trial, they're, you know, recording diaries and being monitored by telephone calls or whatever with nurses. And just seeing some of the comments that are also coming up by people who are, you know, watching this, is that people aren't aware that clinical trials are out there as well. And I think that's one of the key things, is how can we as patient organisations get that knowledge out there? And we've stepped into that space a little bit more recently to try and promote clinical trials, but it's how do we support that, you know, promotion of the clinical trial with the knowledge that is going to get somebody to step across the line to participate in it and alleviate their fears of participation.
So you mentioned before that obviously clinical trials are more likely to be a consideration when patients are faced with a life-threatening condition. But even patients with chronic disease, you know, that's severely impacting their quality of life, where current treatment choices are ineffective, is an opportunity for a discussion about a clinical trial. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's also, the discussion needs to be had at, you know, GP level, but as, you know, Jeremy said, or specialist level, the timing of being able to have those discussions and about what the clinical trial is, and taking people through the protocols of a clinical trial would, you know, it's that would be really helpful as well. You know, we, as you said, I'm a carer as well of a daughter that has Down syndrome, and she also had infantile spasms, and we participated in a clinical trial. She was the first one enrolled in Australia in the trial, and the 55th, I think it was, in the world, which was to measure, going back into Peter's element of, to determine which epilepsy drug was suitable in combination. So they had decided that there was 5 epilepsy drugs, and they wanted to start using 2 at the same time. And you either got, you know, drug A, drug B, or drug A and B, or, you know, certain combinations. And both my wife and I are, you know, really well educated. She works in the health, you know, sphere, and we were able to sit down with the neurologist at the Children's Hospital and talk through it and ask all the questions. And, you know, we went for it because, you know, as I can still remember the words that he said there's nothing ill that can come of this, because the medications have been used for the last 20 or 30 years. So there was nothing that, you know, could have a negative impact on her.
Yeah. So communication was obviously really key to you
Yeah.
making that decision, because the risk benefit profile was made clear to you. So yeah, communication, I think what I'm hearing, is absolutely key. So Susie, you've been very patient in the background there. I'm sure you've got lots to say. As I said earlier, you're the National Program Manager for Partner Network, which is a solution-focused program that's supporting rural practices to be more research ready. I know you've got a couple of slides prepared for us to talk us through this program. So I might let you do that now, and then we could move into some questions after that.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. It's been such a rich discussion already. I'm finding I'm learning a lot. Anyway, I'll pop up some slides and speak about the practice network now. So, okay, you should be able to see a slide that says partner, the first national rural practice-based research network. Okay, fantastic. So I might just break down some acronyms firstly. So practice-based research networks, or PBRNs, are collaborations between clinical practitioners in primary care, practice managers, and primary care researchers. So these networks better align research to the clinical need and can generate new ideas for research from GPs' clinical work. They encourage collaborative research that uses members' own clinical data to address research questions, and also aim to build research capacity in the primary healthcare workforce. So in that way, the hope is to create a primary healthcare workforce that better understands research. And that has a follow-on effect of creating an environment of research-ready, so to speak, GP practices that improves the speed and quality of research conducted in primary care. So listening to those who have already contributed before me, there's been a strong focus on the community and consumer involvement in research. And the partner network places a high value on the involvement of our community members and works closely with the community advisory group, meeting regularly and seeking feedback and perspectives on all of the aspects of the development of the network. So that includes the trials that are being promoted by the network and the grassroots advocacy with local GPs that our consumers visit. It is a network under development, and so this slide just represents where we're at. We've been going now for a couple of years, and we're currently in what we're calling phase 4, which is getting our practices up and running. We've got 82 practices that have joined our partner network around the country, and that includes practices in all of the states except for New South Wales, because they've got their own funding model to look at the teletrial model across Australia. I won't go into the details of the teletrial model, but our network falls underneath that funding profile, which is a national MRFF funding profile. So essentially, the way we work is to have a national office, which I sit in, and assisted by our state coordinator in Victoria, that's Hannah. And we have coordinators in that represent the organisations that we collaborate with around the country in each state. And that includes the University of Adelaide in South Australia, the University of Queensland in Queensland, the University of Tasmania, and the University of Western Australia, in addition to the University of Melbourne, where the national office is. So as I was saying, our community advisory group guides us in all of our processes and meets at least 4 times a year for us to gain some insights from the community perspective, and also to help with some decision making and representation. We also have a stakeholder national advisory committee, and that feeds into the development of our national network. I'm very aware that you've given me some generosity to put some slides up. And these are our academic leads from the institutions that I was referring to, our primary care research leads. We also, in preparation for research in our network, we encourage practices to install some efficiency measures. So using a software platform called Torch Recruit can help to identify patients very quickly. But there's also the capacity to extract data that's de-identified that can go into a national database called Patron, and that's managed and maintained here in Australia by the University of Melbourne, and that can be used for the purposes of surveillance, determining research questions that are of clinical relevance in practices in primary care. The focus is very much for partner on regional, rural and remote practices, and that means practices outside of major city centres. So this is just a little heat map of where we're at with that footprint across the country. The red stars are the sites that have currently signed up to the partner network, and you can also see that we've got some map points of areas that we'd also like to increase the network. And then that is just a graphical representation of our recruitment against our key performance indicators or our targets. So as the first national rural PBRN or practice-based research network, we're really proud of what we've been able to achieve so far. The majority of our practices have elected to install the software that I was telling you about, and we've developed an expression of interest process to receive trial expressions of interest from groups that are investigator-led that represent investigator-led trials, and into the future that may also include commercially led trials, much like we were talking about before, say for example a pharmaceutical intervention, and our network also of coordinators around the country that I was referring to that provide some grassroots support directly to the practices themselves, as well as receiving some of those expressions of interest that refer in to us. We've also developed a suite of modules for GP education that's been accredited by the Royal Australian College of General Practice and the Australian College of Regional and Rural Medicine. That education package has been reviewed not only by GPs in practice, but also practice managers, our community reference group, and also for practice nurses as well. So the feedback that we've received has been that it is really effective as an entry-level mechanism to introduce primary care clinicians or practice staff to some of the trials that might be used using worked examples that have been conducted in primary care, and for that to also be relevant for ongoing professional development. So I might stop sharing at that point to pass you back after giving you a bit of information about our network.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much for that overview, Susie. So I'm really interested in the educational component of the program because not all GPs want to be research active. They're not necessarily interested in running clinical trials themselves. So how can the program support GPs that might just want to improve their knowledge and awareness about clinical trials? For the purpose of maybe enabling those conversations with and referring into clinical trials.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of trials that come to the partner network, they can come to us at different stages of readiness. So sometimes it might be an early protocol stage, which is prior to ethics approval, or it can be an established protocol that has already received funding and ethics approval for recruitment. So when it comes into the partner network, a team of academic leads put up the photos before, who are experienced in that clinician researcher space, review the protocol to see if it's appropriate for the primary care setting. and provide feedback. So not all of the expressions of interest are then accepted into the partner network for promotion. But essentially what it gives our network is a way of channeling research that may fit their clinical interests or research interests that they know has already been reviewed by experienced primary care researchers already. All of the trials are different, so they don't fit a one-stop shop model. However, I will say that it's not compulsory. If you join the partner network, you don't have to immediately sign up to the trials that are offered. We have a way of communicating the trials to the network using a bulletin that's produced quarterly, and that just provides a summary to practices. Many of the trials may well be just a patient identification or referral recruitment strategy, but there is a range that goes all the way through to intervention at the practice interface. So that kind of capacity and confidence building may occur over time. So within our practice network, for example, 3 of our sites have got 2 trials running at the moment, and may well want to progress on to being a fully site research ready site that includes having ongoing training to ensure that any interventions that are conducted on site adhere to the full protocol ethics requirements. But that's not necessarily the case for identifying patients and referring them on to a trial group outside of their practice.
Yeah. Has the level of interest from rural GPs participating in the program met your expectations? Are there any particular aspects of the program that have been especially appealing to them?
Yes, we're always mindful that practice activities are very encouraged by the turnout of GPs who attend our practice visits when we do our presentations. Those kind of visits are supported after a long period of engagement, usually through practice managers and supported and facilitated by practice managers. So it is very encouraging when our coordinators visit the practices to see the number of GPs who attend and are interested, and also voice their interest in research. We're also really mindful of some of the things that have already been identified as challenges in terms of the busyness and the workload that happens for GPs in maintaining their patient care needs. So yes, I would say we have been very encouraged by the interest levels. We gather practice level survey information about research interests and preferences. So we're building strategies for introducing and promoting trials that are of most interest to match the community and clinical priorities, and to feed that knowledge back to our research teams at an early stage of trial conceptualization. So we call it a research pipeline that is a two-way process.
Yeah. And are there any program expansion plans to extend the partner network to metropolitan practices?
Well, it's a very hot topic, certainly for the partner network at the moment. The partner network, it represents a proof of concept for the first national rural practice-based research network. As an initiative and undertaking, we're all extremely proud of. Our future plans are currently being discussed, and that includes representatives from our network and would logically include infrastructure for a national rural metro network, and to include all of the states and territories in that model. Our network certainly participates in communities of practice for existing PBRNs, and that may or may not have some overlap in different territories in the future.
Yeah. So maybe just one more question, and then Michelle, I think we might, have you got any questions from the audience that you want to bring?
I do. Yes.
Okay, so just very quickly, Susie, so what adaptations do you think might be necessary to cater for the different dynamics of urban, metropolitan general practice with this program?
So I think basically it's overcoming some of the challenges that are inherent with distance. When we look at some of the protocols, it can be access to assessment centres, whether it's to have a diagnostic imaging done as part of an assessment protocol. It's using technology in such a way that it facilitates access and equity for patients, but it's also an understanding that if you are traveling distance for traveling any distance for rural patients, they've got to take into consideration the management of the medical issue that they are presenting with, and that can be quite burdensome. So I think it's building the understanding of what it actually takes for rural patients to participate in trials. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I might go over to Michelle now. I know we've got some burning questions in the Q&A channel. So.
Yes, we do. From one of our attendees, is there any confidence from the panel that the National One-Stop Shop will produce a patient-friendly and GP-friendly website that includes a clinical trial page? So this is really around, I think we've established at this during this conversation that education is key. So how, is it through the National One-Stop Shop that we provide more strength in educating our communities?
So I know that the National One-Stop Shop, there are plans to have a front door component which provides access to information. So I can see it being holding benefit in providing the public with and clinicians with access to information about current clinical trials, so they can integrate them into those discussions at the point of care. But I'm not sure if anyone's got any views on how it could be used to educate. Was it clinicians or the public?
It's about for patients and GPs, for care providers,
Okay.
I would say.
Yeah, that sounds like another piece of work that could be attached to the plans for that platform. But yeah, certainly something to think about. I don't know if anyone else has got any comments around that. No.
Another very interesting way to educate the community is the use of the term trials as treatments, which I quite like, and I think it's a great way to think about what trials can deliver. Now, not every new intervention in a clinical trial may provide a treatment effect as an outcome in participants, but just this term to make it, I think use of these words to make it more simple for our community to understand that trials aren't for guinea pigs, and to move away from that rhetoric and that narrative, but to think about them in a different way. So this is, again, just another way to bring a message to the community.
I think that's a good question, because the term clinical trials does have a connotation of risk, but that's also true, right? And it's about bringing that risk-benefit profile into perspective. Lillian, you put your hand up, so please, I'd love you to jump in on this one.
Thank you. I just want to add to, I think Murray made that comment. I think in some diseases, like rare diseases, and especially rare cancers, we often say that clinical trial is, in some situations, standard of care, because that's the only option we have to survive. And so I think it's a really important point. I understand there might be hesitation from the scientific community, perhaps, in terms of definitions, but I think from a patient's and public's perspective, it's really important to acknowledge the role of clinical trial as someone's treatment.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
We have another question around what do we know about who are the participants in clinical trials generally. So again, is there biases, you know, is it representative of that population? Is there biases involved?
I can see Lillian nodding her head again.
She is.
It's a topic of passion of mine because, you know, several years ago, I was made aware of the work that ASCO, the American Society of Oncology, something ASCO.
Society of Oncology.
Thank you. I only know it as ASCO. They've published quite a bit of work around diversity in clinical trial, and so there's a group in the UK, and the name escapes me as well, but they've also been doing a lot of work in diversity in clinical trials and generalizability of clinical trials. So the whole goal of clinical trial is to produce, especially in treatment trials, produce a treatment that works for the general population that needs it, right? So it needs to be representative, and so the data that they've collected shows that there is a bias, and exactly what the comment was in relations to certain populations are overrepresented compared to others, and so it's not generalizable. And there's a lot of work being done on diversity in clinical trials, and yeah, I won't take any more time, but I absolutely
no, great point. And look, I know we're on 1 minute past 6, and I don't want to take up any more of anyone's valuable time. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their valuable insights during today's webinar, and everyone for attending. This is only the beginning, you know, of a conversation that we plan to continue in an area we plan to explore. So if you want to learn more about our plans in this space, please feel free to reach out, and your participation in conversations in webinars like this makes that exploration possible. So we really appreciate everyone's time. I think we could keep talking for another hour, but just conscious of giving everyone back their evening. So thank you again for making time to be here, and we will be producing a report after today's session, just consolidating all the perspectives that have been shared, and there will be a recording also available of the webinar on our website, and we'll keep everyone updated with that. So thank you very much to everyone again for your participation. It's greatly appreciated. Have a nice evening.
Thank you for the facilitation.
thanks
Susie. Thanks, Peter. Thank you, Murray.
Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Lillian.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.